Welcome to Asiatique. I'm your host, Dr. Raymond. In this series, we're going to help you look at Asia from a very different perspective. And in this episode, we're going to look at Taliban. So, in this episode, we're going to talk about Afghanistan. Taliban, isn't it? Now, the thing is, a lot of people were talking about Taliban from the perspective of the US Army leaving Afghanistan, of what happened with the Taliban military people, etc., etc. But no, we're not going to talk about that because you can actually find all those information from the news. So what we're going to talk about is something different. In 1986, Dutch social scientist Geert Hofstede put forward a very controversial theory, and it's called cultural dimensions. Now, what cultural dimensions engulfs is that there are 6 different areas in which you can sort of measure a culture in terms of the power distance, in terms of individualism, in terms of masculinity, uncertainty, avoidance, long-term orientation, and indulgence versus restraint. Now, what these are about, now we're going to look at just 2 of them, okay, for the time being. So the first thing we call power distance is what you would do when you see something that is unfair, the degree at which you would accept something that is not fair. Now, what does that mean? That means people in Asia tends to not say anything when they see something that is not fair. Now, but there's a problem. When you see things that are not fair and you're not saying that, what does that mean? That means your society is not going to be, airing your grievances or sort of telling everybody that this is not fair, we got to do something about it. They're not going to do that. So that becomes very different. Now, let's take a look at differences between countries or among countries. Let's say China, Russia, and the United States of America. And Afghanistan this time. We're talking about Taliban, right? So we have to talk about Afghanistan. Now, if you look at that, how would you measure power distance? No, well, we're not going to go into that, but values for power distance are like that. Say, for example, if you look at China, if you look at Russia, their power distance are what we call large power distance. Well, what does that mean? That means they could tolerate something that is not fair, or people there would tolerate things that are not fair. Well, it doesn't mean that they're not gonna complain. They're still gonna complain anyway. Let's take United States first. In the United States, we're talking about, now let me give you some ballpark figures, okay? From 0 to 100, we're talking about China getting 80 marks, Russia getting 93, which means they have what we call large power distances. And then for United States, we're talking about 40, which means it's quite low, quite small. And then what about Afghanistan? Well, you won't believe this. Afghanistan, 20. What does that mean? That means if you're going to talk to a certain person in Afghanistan and you're telling him something that he or she thinks is not fair, he is going to complain right away. Now, wait a minute. That means they are more, what do you call that? They're more complaint friendly than Americans. Can you believe that? No, you won't, because you don't see that. You thought they were in a kind of society where they are forced not to have education. Girls, they're forced to wear hijabs, they're forced to have long beards, things like that. But the problem is they actually have a much lower power distance than the Americans. Now, that is something not quite obvious to the world. Now, then there's this other factor, individualism. So, are you supposed to take care of yourself if you have a huge family, a large family, and you expect people to be taken care by, family members? You don't expect to sort of take care of yourself individually. Then you're sort of like coming from a collectivist society, which means you have a very low individualism, okay, or low value of individualism. Now, if you look at that, then how do we compare China, Russia, America and Afghanistan? Now, China and Russia have very low individualism, which means they're collectivists. So together, they look after each other in exchange for unquestioned loyalty, something like that. But then what about Americans? Americans, we're talking about 91. So from 0 to 100, we're talking about 91. So they're very individualistic, which means that they take care of themselves instead of expecting the mothers or the fathers or the family to take care of them. No, they'll take care of themselves. For example, if you ask Canadians, the moment you reach 18, the moment your dad is going to say, hey, come on, get yourself a place. You have to be independent, something like that. Now, but then what about Afghanistan? Now, in Afghanistan, what you will see is it's around 60, which means it's much more, or they are much more individualistic than Chinese and Russians. But they're not as individualistic as Americans. Now, what does that mean? That means, now, if you still remember our numbers, we say for power distance, we have China and Russia with very large power distances, where America and Afghanistan are having low power distances, or small power distances. And then with individualism, we have China and Russia having very low individualism, which means they are rather collectivist, whereas Americans, both Americans and people in Afghanistan are having quite high individualism. Now, when you have that kind of an individualism, what does that mean? You expect you to be taking care of your own self. You don't expect people to give you help. Now, if you look at that, you might think, what the heck is going on in Afghanistan? Now, Americans have been there for like 20 years. Since 2001. And they've been putting in the money, putting in all sorts of funds, trying to develop the city, trying to develop the country, but they are not getting it. Now, you might ask, the moment you see these figures, the moment you see these numbers from, for China, for Russia, for America, United States of America, and Afghanistan, people from Afghanistan, they don't behave like Russians. In a way, they behave like Americans. Now, believe it or not. Now, this is very interesting. You know why? Because this has everything to do with explaining why, when Americans were there for the last 20 years, they weren't able to change a thing in Afghanistan. Try to imagine this. You are dealing with somebody who shares quite the same level of individualism and quite the same level of power distance as you do. And what happened is, when you try to change them, they resist because they're individualists. Now, then you have to know what happened with Taliban. Now, we're talking about Taliban, right? I've been talking to you about cultural theories without talking about Taliban. Why? Because if you don't know these cultural theories, you won't understand why Taliban is gaining popularity in Afghanistan. Now, what happened is, over the last 10 years, Taliban has been trying to change the way they operate in Afghanistan. What happened is, remember I said, people from the Afghans, they do complain. And when they complain, do you know what they complain? They complain about the government, the national government. They complain about Americans being inside the country. So they want Americans out of the country. They complain about that. And what Taliban was doing was that they said, okay, we are now improving. So what are they improving? They're saying, okay, we now have something like an ombudsman. You can complain directly to us and we'll try to entertain your complaints. Wait a minute, I know this sounds like a joke. But if you do read things from them, you would realize that they are changing in a way, say, well, now instead of allowing young people or youngsters to go into military camps, to say, no, unless you are wearing that kind of a huge beard, you won't be considered as a jihad. So if you're not a jihad, then you can't get into those camps. You know what they think about that? Instead of beers, no, they're not thinking about beers. They're thinking about, oh, they're protecting the young people. That's how they construe that concept. So when you tell them, I'm going to give you democracy, I'm going to give you this and that, they won't buy it. Because why? That's too far away. That's not down to the earth. It's not even close. So when you tell them all these things, they'll simply take those as jokes, if not lies. Now, in addition, another thing is how they look at education. Now, previously, people would say, the moment Taliban regains their power, they're not going to allow girls to read, to study, to learn. No. What happened was, back in 2009, they were already saying they have to improve because they realize if they're not allowing education, they're going to lose that regime again. They're going to lose control of the country once again. So they realize that. They are changing. And the thing is, when they tell you, okay, somebody from let's say Taliban tells you, hey, now we're gonna, let your daughter to study again once again, try to compare this with an American telling you, hey, you gotta have the chance to study. Who do you think they would believe? Come on, the one right next to them, Taliban. Try to imagine this. The moment we started this discussion, we're saying Americans are basically, culturally like people from Afghanistan. You are basically fighting your own self. Now, if I try to give you a metaphor, you are trying to change a bunch of roughnecks, to convert from a Muslim into Christians. Do you think you would succeed? No, of course. Definitely no. So what happened here is that you are talking about a whole range of policies that has to be culturally modified in order to suit the people of Afghanistan. And what the Americans did? Nothing. Nothing. Because they're not trying to run that country. They're only trying to sort of fight terrorism. But what we can be sure is that the way Americans were doing in Afghanistan, well, didn't work. Simply because the Americans did not do anything to match with the local culture. They can't really infiltrate into the society of Afghanistan. Well, you could say that is such a major flaw if you're talking about, well, invading a country. Because if you invade a country, you want to manage it, don't you? Now, if you're not going to manage it, don't invade it. So if you're invading it, make sure you can conquer it, you can manage it. So, until then, ciao!
Before you leave, please be sure to like, subscribe, hit that notification bell, and share this with your friends. See you in the next episode!